Today, I want to spend a few minutes of my time talking about who I think is the most overrated team in every Power 5 conference. Since we're only talking about 5 teams here, this video might not reach 20 minutes, but we will see where it goes. I'm going to talk about each team for a few minutes, talking about why I think they're overrated, talk about their record and schedule, a little bit about their depth chart too, as we always do, and just my personal opinion as to why each team is overrated. It was not easy to pick for all of these teams. The Big Ten and SEC, those names jumped right out to me. Similar with the Big 12, not the Pac-12. The Pac-12 and ACC were murkier waters. I had to think about it for a few seconds to a few minutes. And even though I came to conclusions about which team I was going to talk about and list as being overrated, for those two conferences, I think there are a plethora of teams that could be talked about as overrated. I'll give you a few hints here. Like Oregon, USC, I would say those two for the Pac-12. And then for the ACC, it could be Clemson, it could be Pittsburgh, it could be Miami, NC State. I mean, the ACC, nearly half of their conference could possibly be classified as overrated, in my opinion, with respectable and sufficient evidence to back it up. But without further ado, let's get right into this video and start off with the team that I think out of these 5 is the most overrated. Let's start off with Texas A&M. Texas A&M, I think, is the most overrated team out of all of the overrated Power 5 teams. It's just my opinion. And it's because of the recruiting hype. Would Texas A&M be talked about as this top 5, top 6 team if they didn't just get the number 1 class? Ask yourself this question. And I'm not discounting, and I'm Jimbo Fisher, and I'm not going to go to the point of saying, oh, well, he paid for his class, because the people who say that, you can have your opinion. There's no evidence to it. And I mean, I genuinely think that with NIL and stuff, it certainly helped Texas A&M, and there might be something fishy going on there. But as being someone who's trying to present an honest opinion and trying to back up my opinions with evidence on this channel, not in personal opinion or conversation, I can't say that Texas A&M purchased their class. It was a good job of Jimbo Fisher to assemble that number 1 class, and it's going to help him a lot in the next year, 2, and 3 when these guys mature and are under the belt of college football training for a few months to a year. But a high school recruiting class doesn't just come in and fix the issues at hand. Maybe a transfer portal class will, as seen with Michigan State and as seen with other programs as well. But a recruiting class, these are guys who haven't even played college football yet. You can't expect them to all of a sudden just come up, fill the starting roles or even the 2-deep roles, and come in and help Texas A&M face a very tough SEC schedule. I mean, face it, Texas A&M's schedule, playing at Alabama, playing at Auburn, at South Carolina, South Carolina and Auburn, I think, are teams that are going to be better than advertised. Alabama's Alabama. Mississippi State is a total trap game, as it's before the Bama game. Arkansas is a tough opponent, and Miami at home is no easy challenge. Same thing with the entire SEC schedule. With what Texas A&M has done under Jimbo Fisher for the last, I think it's been 4 years that he's been here, most of their seasons they do have 4 losses, 3 out of the 4 of them, and mainly because of the turnover on the roster. They barely return any starters on defense. They lost their amazing DC Mike Elko to be the head coach at Duke because of, I think, just how the offense has worked at Texas A&M. Questions at quarterback. Devon Achane, I would say, is probably Texas A&M's, or possibly Texas A&M's best player. The offense has not necessarily been the strength of this team under Jimbo Fisher. They have had solid defenses, though, and with the amount of turnover on defense, new defensive coaching staff, and questions all over the team, I'm just not very high on Texas A&M. I think this class will positively impact them in years and months to come. I have Texas A&M losing to Arkansas at Alabama, at South Carolina, and at Auburn. So they will be undefeated at home. They will be a force to be reckoned with. I can see their ceiling being 10-2, which would be very good. And then I would say if they reach the 10-2 record, the expectation will be met if they go 10-2 with the schedule that Texas A&M has been provided with. Up next, we have someone in the fellow state of Texas A&M, but a different conference. We have Texas. Texas, to compare it with their rival Texas A&M, let's just have a little bit of fun here, I think is less overrated, despite the fact that I have their record being worse, and Texas is being talked about as this Big 12 contender, as this team who can win the Big 12. They're even favored by some to win the Big 12. And I think that some of it is I've made a video about how I think they're overrated. Some of it is reasonable, and I'm going to tell you why. My position-by-position rankings do not favor their defense. It makes their defense look like it is going to be a critical weakness that will likely hold them back in every game they're going to lose. Make no mistake, Texas is going to score on everyone they play. With quarterback Quinn Ewers, if he doesn't start, you have Hudson Card, who could start at most schools, whether it's Power 5 or Group of 5. You have Bijan Robinson in that backfield. At wide receiver, you have Xavier Worthy, Isaiah Nayor. You have an incoming transfer from Iowa State. You have Ajay Hall. You have Jaleel Billingsley at tight end. I mean, Texas just has weapon after weapon after weapon. Plus, they poached Pittsburgh's wide receivers coach, who coached up Jordan Addison. So Texas is loaded on offense, and their offensive line, well, I don't think it will be anything special. In theory, has improved based on depth from last year, so that's a positive. If Texas just has a slightly better defense and a slightly better O-line and a slightly better special teams than I think they will, same situation with like Nebraska last year. You change a few things as to what I think Texas can be, they can win 10 games and reach the Big Ten championship game. I just think because of the broken mentality that is Texas, because I just looking at how they collapsed last year, looking at how they haven't filled many holes on defense. They brought in a James Madison University linebacker who was an FCS All-American in. That was about it on defense, besides Ryan Watts from Ohio State, who was looking to be a backup corner there. So Texas has really been filling in their strengths. I like it. Any Texas fan will like it. But their lack of almost targeting weaknesses does concern me a bit, which is why I have them going 7-5, 5-4 in the Big 12, and finishing right in that middle-of-the-road 5th spot. I have them losing to Alabama, losing to Oklahoma, losing at Oklahoma State, Kansas State, and Baylor. All of those teams are ranked in my top 20. So I do think Texas has a tougher schedule than advertised as well. I'm pretty high on Oklahoma and Oklahoma State more specifically, along with Baylor and Kansas State. In fact, Kansas State's been a team that's on my radar, and I'm growing to like them more and more in exchange for liking Baylor and Oklahoma State less. But Texas's schedule is no easy task, especially with that Alabama game, which could determine the mentality of the team. Week 2, if they have a bad loss, the team might already be broken. And if they win in week 2, who knows? Then just throw my prediction out the door, because if they beat Alabama, I don't see how they're going any worse than like 11 or 10 wins, honestly. And it's probably more so no less than 11 if they beat the Crimson Tide, who are going to be a really good team next year. Steve Sarkisian, I'm still uncertain as to how good of a coach he is, but he is a demon play caller. You saw it at Alabama. You saw it with Texas last year. Their offense sputtered at times. It collapsed. But I think that was more mental weakness and offensive line problems than it was Steve Sarkisian and Texas's play calling. They have a 5-star quarterback, someone who could contend for the best running back in the nation, who's both a ground and receiving threat, which is terrifying if you're facing a running back like that, and their wide receiver core could be the best in the nation as well. So Texas, they have a really high ceiling, one that's higher than Texas A&M, but they also have that very low floor, kind of like Nebraska in the Big Ten, except I am high on them. Next up, we have USC. And when I say overrated in this video, I want to clarify this doesn't mean I'm thinking that, it's impossible that this team will fulfill expectations. I think all of these teams are actually capable of fulfilling their expectations. USC could totally win the Pac-12. And like I said, when you get in the Pac-12, you get into the ACC, you get some murkier waters here. And we're getting into the Pac-12 right now, and we'll get into the Big Ten hint at the end of the video. I don't think there are many overrated Big Ten teams, but USC. I think for USC, really what it boils down to is, honestly, it's year one. That's what it boils down to. Year one in a busted program, can you immediately win the conference and get to the playoff? Like Lincoln Riley did when he took over and established, well taken care of, nurtured, strong cultural foundation in Oklahoma back in 2017. That's what happened when he took over that well-established, well taken care of, the foundation. It wasn't settled with salt water, so it wasn't rotting away. It was nicely taken care of. It was like a well-maintained house or a well-maintained mansion, and he walked in and he continued to maintain it and even upgraded it at some points. Despite what some Oklahoma fans say, Bob Stoops did not have some great years, and then he handed it off to Riley, and Riley had consistent seasons where at most he had 2 losses, and that's something to be proud of. Lincoln Riley's a really good coach, and I think that his staff is one of the best that we're talking about among these teams. He has Caleb Williams at quarterback. He has Jordan Addison and Mario Williams as his wide receivers. He has Travis Dye as his running back. He has weapons too, a lot of weapons, and he couldn't bring all of his staff over from Oklahoma as well, but he did make some nice additions as well. I think Josh Henson is the name of USC's offensive coordinator over there, and I think that the more I looked into it, I did think that was somewhat of an underrated addition, though I wouldn't rank it at the top, but an underrated addition nonetheless. And so I like the moves that Lincoln Riley has been making, especially in the portal. By far the number 1 portal class, salvaged what was a poverty-stricken USC class when Clay Helton was fired, immediately gets in there, and the 2022 recruiting class, which looked unsalvageable, was somewhat salvaged by Lincoln Riley. Again, the question is not what Lincoln Riley can do long term, because I think next year you're going to definitely see major breakthrough, because after a year you've established your culture generally, you've developed your players for a year, and we all know that by development and culture standards, Lincoln Riley's a better head coach than Clay Helton. You cannot dispute that. But USC, they still have to establish the Riley culture there. There are things on defense to be fixed. Nonetheless, I don't trust Alex Grinch as a defensive coordinator, especially against teams like Utah and UCLA with their high capacity, versatile offenses. I mean, you talk about dual threat quarterbacks, look no further than Cameron Rising and Dorian Thompson-Robinson. You talk about powerful running backs, you look no further than Zach Charbonnet, Tavion Thomas, Micah Bernard. Look no further than those guys. And I think Utah is going to be a team in the playoff. I think UCLA could be a team that could crack my top 25 even in the preseason before the season begins. High-powered offenses, I don't know if USC's defense can handle them yet. And under Alex Grinch, you have seen that high-powered offenses, like Kansas State, for example, Oklahoma can't handle them, or they couldn't under Lincoln Riley. So it's a big question mark there for USC. It's year one. You have to establish things culturally, but also him bringing over his system, which leaves a USC team that needs rebuilding vulnerable to teams like Utah and UCLA. What can be done there? And then I think the Notre Dame loss is mainly just because of the fact that Marcus Freeman, again, he's taken over a solid, well-built program. USC needs rebuilding. I don't think that game will be very indicative of who's the better coach. And I think, almost quite obviously, I think that Lincoln Riley is the better coach than Marcus Freeman and will be in the long term. But I have USC losing to at Utah, at UCLA, losing in a close one at home to Notre Dame. That game is pretty close to a 50-50 game. Up next, we got Clemson. The Tigers, not a very overrated team, but I looked at all the other teams. I looked at the fact that, Clemson's expected to make a run at the playoffs again. They're given a lot of benefit of the doubt here. And there is some reason behind it. Dabo Swinney is a fantastic coach. He's 2-2 versus Nick Saban, if I remember that correctly. And, he's beat him twice. He's actually 2-1 versus Saban in national title games, so if that doesn't speak to how good of a head coach he is, I don't know what else does. But here's the problem. The offensive line. In that spring game and in last season, the offensive line was non-existent. And if your offensive line is non-existent, your offense is pretty handicapped. Speaking of being handicapped, the quarterback situation doesn't help either. I think the quarterback situation with Cade Klubnik being there is better than most in the nation. But Clemson doesn't need most in the nation, or better than most in the nation with their offensive line situation. Robbie Caldwell retired, they lost some guys, and it looks bad. It looks bad up there. In the spring game, I think Clemson the defense had 10 plus sacks. And that speaks to how good the D-line is, too. I think it might be the best defensive line in the nation, despite Clemson's D-tackles coach leaving and DC Brent Venables leaving. I think the defense is going to be pretty solid. It's been left with great assistants who Brent Venables tutored, managed. I think the defense is going to be great. The question, again, is the offense. As Josh Pate has said on his show before, if they travel to Georgia Tech and it's a close game, or they lose, I'm thinking more so it'll probably be a close game knowing the state of Tech's program. If it is close or Clemson is bad, I don't think Clemson will even lose to Tech. But if they play Tech closely and it's a struggle, you likely know how the rest of the season is going to go. And I don't think it'll be that bad, but I think their offensive line, their wide receiver room, losing Justin Ross, they really don't have those big body X-Factor wide receivers. Their quarterback doesn't look like an X-Factor guy, especially after last year. I like Will Shipley as a running back, but again, an impaired offensive line will impair Will Shipley's ability to affect opposing defenses. I think Clemson's schedule, though, lines up with them very nicely. Their defense will be able to shut down teams like Wake Forest, Boston College, NC State. Their defense will be good enough to shut down teams with just inferior talent. And having NC State at home instead of traveling to them, huge bonus, because Death Valley, intimidating place to play. I think that Clemson loses on the road to Notre Dame. Notre Dame is the most talented team they face in the regular season. Notre Dame it's a road game. They lost to them in 2020 when there were barely any fans there. And I think that'll be a close game, pretty 50-50 game, but I think that home field advantage and the fact that Notre Dame will have a much better offensive line will help decide that game. And I think their second loss comes to losing to Pittsburgh in the ACC championship game. Pittsburgh being another one of those teams who could be on this list. There's a very good reason to have Pittsburgh here instead of Clemson. Losing Jordan Addison, losing Mark Whipple, losing Kenny Pickett. Those are three reasons right there. But I think Pat Narduzzi has finally broken through. He's had enough transfer portal additions, and I think that Nick Patty, who was the backup to Kenny Pickett last year, looked good. Looked like he could fill a starting role next year. And Keaton Slovis, with some better non-Clay Helton coaching, could break through and repeat some of his success and superior play that he had in 2019 and 2020. So Clemson, I think they'll be better than last year by a decent margin. They'll just fall short of reaching the playoff, though, in a loss in the ACC championship game. They'll go undefeated in conference in the regular season because against tougher teams like Miami and NC State, they host them. Their road schedule outside of Boston College, I think they match up well with every team there. But look out for Boston College. I think they're one of the more underrated Power 5 teams. And finally, we have Wisconsin. Wisconsin here is a team that I think is overrated, not because of past success. I mentioned that with Texas A&M and with Texas. Like, the past success just tells me that they might not break through next year. And I haven't seen enough of what I've liked, like I have with Nebraska, but maybe my judgment's just a little bit clouded there. But anyway, back to the point. Wisconsin needs a quarterback. And you might say, well, they have a quarterback. They have Graham Mertz. As far as I am concerned, Graham Mertz is on the field to hand the ball off. Did you not see last year, the Minnesota game? The Michigan game, he actually looked pretty decent. And the Penn State game, the Notre Dame game. Every game with a solid defensive line, with a talented front seven, with a amazing DC. And the Iowa game was sort of an exception to the rule, but I think Iowa's D-line, and it was mainly their secondary and linebacker core last year that was so good for Iowa. Any team with a competent defensive line, Wisconsin struggled against. And it was even really the case with defense. Minnesota, Michigan, Notre Dame, Penn State abused them. And eventually, Wisconsin's offensive line turned around, and they return enough, specifically Joe Tippmann as their starter, but return enough pieces around him too to where I think they'll have one of the best O-lines in the country. I think that'll be more so fixed even with Joe Rudolph's departure. Jim Leonard loses a ton on defense, only returns 3 starters, including Nick Herbig, who I think will win Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year. But there will be more reloading on the defense than some will expect. But offense is the concern with Graham Mertz at quarterback. I don't like him. His backup Chase Wolf isn't good. I don't know if Deacon Hill is good either. I thought they really needed, like Iowa, if they want to win the Big Ten or have a chance at doing it, they needed a transfer portal QB. There were so many options, and they never got any of them. So, if Mertz breaks through and proves me wrong, and this is just an opinion, this whole video is, so I can be proven wrong, but good for him. But I just don't see it happening with the wide receivers he has, Jake Ferguson departing at tight end. I see him as a tool to hike it, hand the ball off to Braylon Allen or Ches Malusi, and if push comes to shove and they can't run it, then what's going to happen is you are going to have more interceptions than touchdowns, which, happened last year for Graham Mertz. I don't like Wisconsin's QB situation. If they had a better quarterback, I might have them winning the West, immediately. Might have them winning the West. But I think that there are other holes as well, like at wide receiver. Special teams as well doesn't help. And I don't think the offensive staff is that good, but I think Bobby Ingram, despite being unproven, showing that he was hired and Joe Rudolph was sort of pushed out, does give me hope that Paul Chryst knows he needs change, and an adapting, changing head coach will get you places. And I still think Paul Chryst is a solid head coach. Wisconsin's schedule is tough as well. They're just outside of my top 25, though. They're like 26th or 27th if I just had to put a number to them. At Ohio State, at Michigan State, at Iowa, at Nebraska. That is a tough road game stretch. I have all of those teams but one in Iowa ranked in my top 20. I have Nebraska and Ohio State as top 10 teams. Iowa can certainly contend for the ranking spot too, and Iowa just having a solid defense and their intimidating home field advantage means they'll probably be able to shut down Wisconsin pretty well and do just enough, especially with their superior special teams, to force some mistakes, make some things happen, and win. But I think that Wisconsin will avenge their loss to Minnesota. They'll beat Purdue again, who I think is another very underrated team. And I think that this year is just going to be sort of a prove-it year, but also a rebuilding year with just how much Wisconsin lost. That's all I have to say for this video. If you liked it, make sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this video and who you think the most overrated Power 5 teams, one each for conference, are. Tell me that down below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys around. Bye.